Thank you again. And let's talk some history first. And thank you again. Rabbi Kamin, as some of you may or may not know, is a scholar of the history of Dr. Martin Luther King. He's written multiple books about King. So Rabbi Kamin, if we were to go back exactly 50 years to Dr. King on his birthday in 1967, remind us, how old is he and what's his state of mind?
Dr. King was 38 years old in 1967. He was a young man. His state of mind was not so good. He was depressed, although he never lost all of his spirit. He felt deflated. He wasn't particularly seen as that useful anymore in the civil rights movement because of his stance on the Vietnam War, which now has been more than vindicated by history, of course. He was determined to take a position against the war because he saw it as part of the sphere of what he called my moral field of vision. So he spoke up on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before the assassination in Memphis, and took us on and lost President Johnson's support and many in the black community as well. So he was a man who was drifting and in need of some consolation himself.
And we'll get more to the speech in a minute with Reverend Forbes because it was in your house. But part of the historical context is that the major civil rights laws had just been passed in the previous few years. The Broad Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, probably most centrally, and President Lyndon Johnson was waging a war on poverty. King might have been optimistic about breathing life into those laws so they actually changed people's lives. Why did he not focus on that rather than going on to Vietnam and other things?
Well, I don't think he lacked any focus on that, and these were great personal victories for him. But he was, we tend to deify Martin Luther King. He was a man. He had emotions. He was scared a lot for his physical safety. And he also had a healthy ego. He enjoyed a good crowd when he spoke. And he didn't feel, in '67, on a personal level, that he was as lauded and appreciated as he wished he still was. And he felt a tremendous loneliness. I don't in any way contravene the accomplishments and the pride he felt in it, but he wasn't about himself. He felt that the country was on a good moral course domestically, but the Vietnam War did consume him.
So, Reverend Forbes, as you know, it was 1 year to the day before Dr. King was killed, April 4th, 1967, that he gave the speech close to this building, at your building, the Riverside Baptist Church. The speech was titled, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence. What was the most significant thing, or a few most significant things about that speech?
First of all, that speech, which many people don't know, was written not necessarily totally by Dr. King. And I always, like to have a prop. Basically, Vincent Harding, who had been working with King so that he understood his principles, his hopes, his aspirations, sort of like the presidents have speechwriters, so Vincent Harding helped write that speech. But the significant thing about that speech was it demonstrated the extraordinary prophetic courage of Dr. King. He was not naive about the impact of his taking on his government, and even in that speech saying that our government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. But the fact was that in that speech, he called this nation to a new sense of vocation beyond even what we understood in regards to the I Have a Dream time. He says, if America is going to be on the right side of the world revolution, she must undergo a radical revolution of values. And then he tried to make sure that we understood that the war in Vietnam was completely opposite to the spirit that was present in the revolutionary beginnings of our nation, in the democratic ideals of our nation. The most significant thing then is He made it clear that America would never be the great nation and could not keep faith with the Constitution itself unless radical values, not just about race, but about the fundamental structures and the basic principles upon which the nation was built. So it was a call for radical revisioning and restructuring of the whole system in the United States of America.
It's one of the memorable King phrases, radical revolution of values. You know, I don't know if you saw it or if anybody here saw it, but just this weekend there was an article in USA Today about this speech. And the headline of this article was, "This 1967 speech may have helped put a target on Martin Luther King's back."
That's a fascinating comment because in this book, Martin Luther King, the inconvenient hero, that's what Vincent Harding called it, he had a conversation with James Lawson because both Vincent and James Lawson felt that they might have had a role in creating the conditions under which Dr. King was assassinated. In the first case, it was James Lawson who had invited him to Memphis. In the second case, it was Vincent Harding who had written this thing, and so they had conversation with each other. Do you feel guilty about the role you played? And both of them said, no. We discerned which way he was being led. We knew he was going to go that way. We simply were instruments of the expression of the deep prophetic longing in his heart.
And just one more thing before we bring on Joshua Lazard, thank you for your patience. That article reminded us that after the speech, and I never knew this, the New York Times actually ran an editorial against it that said, quote, "The strategy of uniting the peace movement with civil rights could very well be disastrous for both causes." So why might the Times have thought that? And what do you think, with 50 years of hindsight, about that concern?
Are you asking me that?
I am.
Most Americans today like to pigeonhole various causes and then to deny the relationship of those causes to be discerned.
So,
If I can keep you in your lane and keep them in their lane, and Black Lives Matter in their lane, and legislative agendas in why we can water down the creative, transformative possibility. That's what they said. So that's what they thought then. That's what many people think now.
Joshua Lazard, hey, I see we didn't get to meet downstairs. I know these guys. I see your online bio says you're the first C. Eric Lincoln Minister for Student Engagement at Duke University. Tell us about it a little. We have Duke in the house? Any UNC? No. Okay, we got a rivalry going here already. How much is that, student engagement, Office Minister for Student Engagement, in a social justice context? How much in a purely religious context? Or how would you describe the engagement work that your title suggests?
Much of the student engagement work that we do, oftentimes it's one-on-one conversations, but it's also being a presence on a campus that 2015, a noose was hung on campus. It's being a presence for Black students and students of color. It's also being able to engage in those conversations. Actually, I'll even go as far as to say conversations with white students who actually feel comfortable enough to actually ask questions with me, and I get to tell them about my various experiences growing up like on the south side of Chicago. They're like, never talked to anybody, about these things. And a lot of that looks like on a day-to-day basis. It looks like that from week-to-week basis. We try to do programming as well around some of these issues. We read books together with students.
Is there a Martin Luther King Jr. birthday tradition of any kind at Duke? Is there awareness of the kinds of things, historical things, that Reverend Forbes and Rabbi Kamin have been talking about among the students you work with today?
Yeah, there are. Actually, their MLK Day event is today at 3 o'clock. Obviously not there this year, but that's something that's been going on for quite some time now. They've had, William Barber was one of the speakers within the recent memory. Yeah, and that's been a good thing for North Carolina as well as for Duke too. And students show up to these events as well.
This panel this particular panel is being defined as about history, but I don't want to ignore the intensity of the moment for so many people, with Obama going out and Trump coming in. You are three religious leaders. Is there a response? And Joshua Lazard, why don't you start? Is there a response to the moment that spiritual or religious morality, that a Martin Luther King-like spiritual morality perhaps can address?
Yeah, honestly, as I was hearing Dr. Forbes talk, remembering the gravity of the Beyond Vietnam speech, I think there's an opportunity to think about beyond Trump, and the idea that we will survive the next 4, God forbid, the next 8 years, but we will survive that. And thinking about what the long game of that looks like. How can we stay vigilant right now? What are the things that we can do that maintains life? What are the things that we can do that builds community together? And do so in religious and also in non-religious areas as well. And so one of the conversations that I've been having with my students pretty frequently now post-elections about, they look like they have despair about themselves. And it's like, well, you will survive this. You will get out of this. This did not come to stay. It came to pass. And I think that's a way in which I can help people look forward and look beyond Trump.
Rabbi Kamin, want to continue?
Well, I think it'd be presumptuous of me to imagine what Dr. King would actually say, but I'm thinking about 67, his last year, 68, when he was, as I mentioned, a sullen figure in some ways, but he felt that he had to go to Memphis. The civil rights movement, the Poor People's Campaign, was really not getting traction, but he went down there because of his principles. He didn't let the greater situation stop him. He wanted to go down there to help some garbage workers get a 10-cent raise and get some uniforms and have the right to unionize. So maybe what Dr. King would tell us today is if you're irate, participate. Yeah? And if you're mad, well, get bad.
Reverend Forbes.
That's good enough.
Do we leave that as a nonverbal response, or do you want the last word?
I think that the important thing I'm hearing is that quite frequently, darkness provides a backdrop for the winter spectacular of divine grace. So that means that sometimes, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, you got to hit bottom before you even know how low you are. And so maybe in a strange and perverse way, the current scene in our government with all of the anxiety we've got provides this backdrop against which, number one, we say, they have messed this thing up so badly that we really do finally need the Lord. That's a good place. And secondly, what I discover is that when it really gets bleak like it is, then the Great Spirit organizes the dream team, because you need a real dream team. So what I'm asking folks to do is, look, folks, let's really sign up to be a part of the dream team. And the way the dream team happens is the thing that happened to Dr. King when the Spirit met him at that table. A lot of us need to sit at the table until the Spirit comes to us and shows us what we need to do, and then we need to get up and get on the path so that we, along with King's Spirit and with cosmic companionship, can take this, which is the worst of times, and turn it into the better or the best of times.
Hallelujah.
Now, I am asked to remind you that you are just as important to this conversation as our panelists here on the stage, and WNYC's Talk Box is waiting for you after the program out in the lobby. It looks like an old phone booth, but when you pick it up, it asks you what social justice issue is most important to you. So later on, go out there and record your thoughts before you leave. You might hear yourself tomorrow on the radio. We'll be playing excerpts on my show from 10 a.m. to noon of this whole event this afternoon, and maybe we'll use some of those if we can. All three of these panelists will be back in other configurations later in the afternoon. Please thank them for now.